Hello, you're listening to Constructive Thinking, a podcast by the Progressive Contractors Association. My name is Stephen Hamilton. I'm Director of Public Affairs for PCA Ontario. In this episode, we'll be discussing the results of the provincial election. This episode was recorded on March 3rd, 2025. In it, I'll be interviewing Sam Duncan. Sam is Vice President at Wellington Advocacy. He has held senior roles in the offices of both Ontario Premier Doug Ford and Prime Minister Stephen Harper. I hope you enjoy.
Great. Okay, well, welcome, Sam. Thanks for joining us today. We are about 1 week away from the provincial election, which was last week. The Ontario PC Party won a significant victory, capturing 43% of the vote, capturing 80 seats in the legislature. This is basically on par with what they did in 2022. Really not much happening in the campaign. It was kind of a quieter campaign in terms of a lot of the policy issues. I guess, what exactly happened? What were there any big issues in this campaign?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Stephen. It's great to be with you today. First, I'd like to say, as it relates to the campaign, certainly what dominated the campaign were external issues, external factors. The threat that Donald Trump has placed on Canada and Canada's economy and ultimately Canadian sovereignty really dominated a lot of the coverage and focus of the campaign. This worked really to the Premier's advantage. And part of it was, the Premier decided when to call an election and time the election at a very advantageous period for him so that he had somewhat of control over the narrative going into this campaign. And certainly that bore out in the results and the campaign itself.
So really not much change in terms of the PC seat count. The Liberals are now an official party. The NDP losing a few seats. They're at 27 now. Were there any kind of commentary you have on how the opposition behaved in this election, some of the issues they tried to make as kind of key issues?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I would say, given that frame of this external threat to Canada, to Ontario, I think a lot of voters were really looking for stability and leadership, and this really played into Doug Ford's kind of brand and ability to, because he's the Premier, to demonstrate leadership to all Ontarians. And I think this really hurt the NDP and the Liberals, and in their ability to punch through with a different message. Both the NDP and the Liberals were trying to talk about other issues. They were trying to talk about healthcare. They were trying to talk about social challenges. They were trying to talk about a lot of different policies and a lot of different areas of interest. But really, when the entire news media is dominated by Donald Trump, that man seems to suck up all of the energy and all of the attention. This really played into the PC's hand, and it really was hard for the NDP and the Liberals to punch through with any sort of message. They were really kind of secondary or kind of irrelevant in a lot of the coverage and a lot of the focus during this campaign. And that really made it very difficult for them to have any sort of breakthrough of ideas or policies.
So one of the big things that the PCs emphasized during this campaign is their support from working class voters. And I guess this is part of a larger, really global shift in stakeholder realignment from the working class to historically conservative parties. In this case, if you look at social media, there was the Conservatives routinely trotted out the 22 endorsements or so, primarily from construction building trade unions. They really thought that was key to, obviously, their stakeholder coalition. If you look at the Premier's tour, again, he really, it was a lot of visits to different building trades, to their training centers, to construction sites. Can you speak a little bit about, I guess, the broader stakeholder realignment, and then how Doug Ford and the PCs are trying to capture that?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Look, I think you're right, first of all, to talk at that kind of macro level. But this is a political realignment we're seeing across the Western world, where conservative parties are becoming much more the party of the working class, blue collar, non-university educated workers. And I would say this doesn't necessarily translate to income level, but it's more a shared living or shared experience that these workers have, these people have, that is just different than the urban managerial professional class. And this shift has really meant that progressive parties have become more inclined to university educated professional managers from large urban centers, and conservatives are shifting towards more the kind of working class, blue collar, non-university educated, sometimes small business owner, sometimes skilled worker, sometimes non-skilled worker. Like there's a whole kind of realignment going on there. I think you're seeing that across the Western world. Doug Ford and the PCs were one of the first, I think, parties to really understand this back in 2018. And this was part of Doug Ford's appeal, right? Doug Ford is, I believe, one of, if not the first premier in our province to not have a university degree, right? He speaks a language of the average person, of the real working man or woman, that transcends kind of partisanship and political parties. And a lot of his appeal, the old Ford Nation, right? There's this group of people that are around Doug, around his people. And what he's done, I think, really effectively is build that coalition out to be more accepting of, for the PCs anyway, of private sector unions being more worker friendly. You've seen a lot of their agenda being seen to try to get these union endorsements and get the workers on side. I would say, though, I think this is bigger than union endorsements. I think union endorsements are kind of a secondary or tertiary result of workers themselves looking for political leaders and political parties that share their values. And I think a lot of this is also, it's a pull in from the PCs and from conservatives, but it's also a push out of progressive parties, the NDP and the Liberals, on a lot of cultural issues. Progressive woke ideology, the boogeyman in the world. But I think as I said, the progressive parties become more urban, professional, managerial class. They just have a different shared priorities on cultural issues than a lot of people. And I often hear when I talk to people that the NDP left me. It's not that I am no longer a worker who wants to support them, but those parties have changed. So I think there's kind of two elements, and Ford has really picked up on those workers who are looking for a home, and he's done enough on kind of small c cultural conservatism to bring them in, while being more open to the uses of the state and spending, and being less free market, free markets orthodoxy. That I think a lot of these workers are not ideological Milton Friedman libertarians, right? And I think that's where the Conservative Party had for a lot of years been associated with. So there's an evolution of the way in which the PCs and Doug Ford have governed that I think has brought this in. But I really, in my view, it's the workers themselves choosing with their votes before union kind of endorsements that are really the symbol here. And I think we kind of saw that in this election, where they had a record number of union endorsements, but they didn't really change the electoral makeup of their coalition, of their pro-worker coalition. And I think that speaks to the more on the ground realities, rather than the edict from on top of a union endorsement.
That's interesting. So it's kind of larger cultural forces. It's certain policy decisions this government's made, but you don't see it necessarily as the endorsement from labor leader so-and-so as driving it.
I don't think it's driving it. Look, I think the government wants those endorsements. I think they give them, from a narrative standpoint, it really helps drive home the narrative that the unions are supporting them. And I think it validates where the workers are already placing their votes. I think that helps them with the media. It helped them frame their election, right? Like outside of the Trump tariff issue, really their secondary issue was worker policy, right? Doing a lot of events at factories, at job sites, with a bunch of workers in hard hats standing behind them. And this was a real narrative effort. So I think when it comes to showing the momentum and then the kind of winning the air wars of a political campaign, it was very effective. but it clearly did not translate into additional votes in, London, Niagara, Hamilton, and Oshawa, areas of the province where they were hoping to make some gains with these types of workers. So I would say it wasn't that it was unsuccessful or that it wasn't helpful. I just don't think it is a direct correlation between more votes and those endorsements.
Right. So maybe you kind of answered this question in that response, but a lot of those labor unions are very political. They've been political historically. They've been part of the political process, by which I mean the electoral process, through things like the Working Families Coalition, which historically was lobbying against conservative governments. Our labor partner at PCA, CLAC, kind of is oriented towards being apolitical, intentionally apolitical. Like they don't endorse candidates. This has been kind of a longstanding practice within CLAC. I'm curious, do you see that as, I guess you don't see that necessarily as a challenge within the context of a hyper-political, more conservative-oriented labor coalition, which typically doesn't include CLAC?
Yeah, look, and maybe just one more point on the building trades folks. I would say, look, it was a big victory for the PCs to get them to not run a Working Families Coalition against them, right? Like the amount of money and resources that were being put when they were oppositional in nature and adversarial in nature, I think would be a big reason why the Tim Hudak PCs feel like they didn't win. They were running against a big machine, and Ford has kind of taken them off the board, and he needs to be given a lot of credit for doing that. But as it relates to kind of CLAC and apolitical kind of organizations, look, I think there's a real alignment of like actual interests, and so when the government looks to their coalition, certainly there's the relationships they have with individual unions that have endorsed them, and the kind of backroom conversations that always occur. But at the end of the day, they need to be representative to the workers who actually voted for the party and voted for the agenda. And in that, CLAC and others are a real voice of a large group of workers in this province who represent a diverse set of views and interests, and the government has to pay attention to them because those views and those interests are very important to the government. I think specifically at the micro level, this is where the real opportunity is engaging with local MPPs and cabinet ministers, right? In local communities where CLAC has a large presence. That's where the power is. These are workers who are voters who have interests that the government needs to address and needs to work with. And so to the extent that there is that alignment, I think the government will always be looking for ways to support and manage the CLAC relationship and on behalf and CLAC's workers. I would say, from the government's view, they've got to manage that relationship within the context of all of the relationships they have, and their approach has been, try to keep everyone happy is a good way to kind of describe, because they understand this dynamic, right? They're trying to keep the workers happy, and so often what they've done and how they've managed this is through transfer payments and funding agreements, and trying to make sure that no one group gets everything they want, but everyone gets a little bit of support that will go into more training of workers to adjust the labor market needs in the province and ensure that this province can build all of the things that it needs to build to continue to grow. And so, I think there's when there's not competition between say a CLAC interest and a building trades interest, I think you'll see a lot of ability to for the government to give it some due consideration. Where there is some competition, they're likely to make nobody happy and try to find a solution that doesn't alienate and either of their the groups that they're trying to look towards.
So I think that's a good segue to talk about more policy, like actually in the weeds policy. So if you look at kind of the Doug Ford 2018, 2019, his first year, 2 years in power, really transformational legislative mandate with respect to the construction industry. So there was winding down of the Ontario College of Trades, which was very controversial from the employer community, as well as from some within organized labor. There was huge cuts to WSIB premiums, the moving to a 1-to-1 journey person to apprentice ratio. You had Bill 66, obviously kind of a cornerstone of PCA interests with respect to open tendering. So there was like a really large number of kind of legislative and regulatory amendments that were, I'll characterize as kind of pro-employer. And then over the past few years, that's been less the case. As you noted, there's been real emphasis on the Skills Development Fund, which was kind of created during the COVID epidemic to fund unique training opportunities. I guess, what do you see going forward? Is it kind of, again, the seat count didn't change much. There wasn't too much movement within the election. Do you see the approach remaining the same over the next 3 or 4 years?
Yeah, Stephen, it's a really insightful point around like the first year versus the last 5. The first year of the Ford government, he had a lot of transformational changes he was trying to do across many different sectors, not just the construction sector, but with healthcare, with economic development, with a number of different files. However, that year didn't go super smooth for the government. It was, at times, kind of a chaotic year. And I think the premier really learned a lot of lessons in that first year around a reluctance to make big transformational changes. The last 5 years of the government, it's kind of put to the side large, complex reforms to institutions. It's really become a lot of really cautious to making big, bold changes. And it's kind of managed risk as opposed to generating risk. And I think a lot of that is, they've been successful in doing that, right? His approach, I'll call it like popularist, like his idea that it is not his job to, change the system, but rather it's his job to reflect what people want and what people expect, and to be the vehicle for people's voices. And that has led to, largely status quo in a lot of areas after that first year, with the exception of some areas where the premier has put in some political capital, tend to be in areas where they spend money, right? It's areas of where they can use money to push out new, infrastructure investments, fast track transportation projects, attract auto investments, those kind of areas. So where you have seen them try to move is where there's dollars attached to things. And I think you saw that in their platform. So the platform that the PCs put forward in this campaign, a lot of dollar figures attached to things, a lot of, hey, we're going to invest in this program, or we're going to fund this project, or we're going to do this thing. Not a lot of, hey, we're going to change the entire structure of our healthcare system, or we're going to, blow up the LCBO, or some other, bigger, bolder kind of policy changes. And so I don't see any reason why the premier would deviate from what has been working for him. I think right now, obviously, there's this threat of Trump and threat of, the American tariff situation, which may necessitate some need for some bigger, bolder action on some regulatory reforms. And to the extent that the premier will do that, I think you'll see him in lockstep with other provinces and other jurisdictions. And where there's political will for things, you'll see him move it. But I don't think you're going to see him really try to make big, bold, transformational changes. I would say that there is, though, built up demand for some of these changes from stakeholders and even from within his own cabinet. This is we didn't, should have talked about this off the top, but it was really a historic victory, right? Three majority governments in the province of Ontario is no small feat. Hadn't been done since the late 50s, early 60s. This is a significant win for the PC party and for Doug Ford. And there now is a desire from some members of the cabinet who I would characterize as more conservative, of like, okay, what are we going to do now? We've won. This is our opportunity to fix a bunch of things that we know are broken and that we've got the political capital to do. But at the same time, he's got a lot of buildup of stakeholders who, have been asking for changes, banging down on his door for, opening up legislation that hasn't been opened up in a while, or making kind of changes that, he may be willing to put more political capital into. And I think this is an open question. To what extent is the premier going to double down on what got him here and has helped him win this historic victory? And how much political capital is he willing to use on maybe making some of these bigger changes? And for this sector, it really is, is there an openness to open up the Labor Relations Act, right? Is that something that is on the table? I don't know, right? I don't know if that is something that they would consider or do, but if they're ever going to, this would be the time. And so to the extent that the premier is looking for, some of these bigger changes and he's pushed by members of his cabinet towards that, we could see that. I would just say, he's unlikely in my mind to deviate a lot from what got him here. He really has been successful for a reason and wants to continue to be that popular, premier who everyone really likes, and is worried about making a mistake and alienating his voters.
So at PCA, obviously we believe, like a lot of other stakeholders, that our recommendations to government are very sound in terms of broader public policy objectives. They're not self-serving. They're in the public interest. So things like access to training, college-based TDAs. So our members, CLAC isn't a training delivery agent. All of our members, when their apprentices are going into training, they're doing so through a college-based training system. Now, with things like the Skills Development Fund, colleges really haven't been able to utilize that funding as much as union training centers will say. So I'm curious, if you look at the platform, and it does appear you're absolutely right with respect to the platform, there's not a lot of legislative or regulatory changes being contemplated that are obvious within that document. There is quite a bit of spending that has been noted, and there was spending specific to some of our concerns with respect to training. So I'm curious if you can kind of highlight a couple nuggets within the policy document that speak to some of our concerns with respect to access to training.
Look, there's two programs and two commitments that I think PCA and CLAC and the broader community need to really focus in on. And there was a $150 million commitment to enhance what's called the In-Class Enhancement Fund. This is the fund where training development agreements, TDAs, are funded out of. In their language, they talked about this going to colleges and universities, but they also go to union training centers as well. And I think there should be a hyper focus on that commitment, and to ensure that the funds that are being set aside for in-class enhancements and TDAs, that colleges get their equal and fair share of the funding for the construction building sector, and that there is a full-thwarted advocacy push to say, colleges need this support, especially in light of the financial situation we're seeing publicly funded colleges face. Following the news, you see programs being suspended and people being laid off seemingly every week in that sector. And so they need the money. They need the money, and we need the workers. And so this should be an alignment here. And I think focusing on that. There is also another program too that I would focus on. That the province committed $75 million to support construction skilled trades programs at colleges and universities in priority areas, I think is the language that they used. And so I think really also ensuring that money kind of flows quickly and can flow to the right colleges and the right programs, that we're actually addressing the real kind of labor market challenges that the building construction sector is facing, and that they're funding good programs at good colleges that are producing the exact workers that we need in the regions of the province we need them. Not every region is the same. And to ensure that there's a real evidence-based decision-making process rather than a political decision-making process. I think in absence of a real credible push, political offices and political ministers are going to make political decisions, as is their right to do so. And it's the job of PCA and others to bring the evidence to bear to demonstrate where's the need and where can the funding be, and ensure that the government knows exactly where to support. And so I would focus, on those two programs. It's a lot of money, unclear over what how many years this funding is. I'm certain it's not in 1 year. I'm certain these are over multiple years, and I would expect these programs to be in a forthcoming budget from the province. But these are real opportunities, real dollar figures that can really help the industry.
So as you know, a lot of our lobbying activity, PCA, does fall within that legislative change bucket. So for instance, the City of Toronto, fair and open tendering there, Bill 66 didn't solve the problem. Our members can't bid on the majority of construction work within the city. We just launched a new campaign today called Fair and Open Toronto. We have a new website, a YouTube clip explaining some of the issues with respect to procurement in Toronto. We have a broader social media campaign. We've written to every single councillor, hoping to get some media pickup on this. So there's the City of Toronto issue. There's the issue with respect to the energy sector. Our members can't bid on any work that is controlled by OPG, Bruce Power, or Hydro One. So there's still quite a bit that the province is responsible for that would require legislative change primarily. How do you recommend? What are your recommendations for PCA in terms of making those government priorities that they don't view as risky?
Yeah, I think I'll get back to my earlier points around the government needs to be responsive to the workers and the voters that elected it. And I think, first of all, it's great to see that campaign on fair and open tendering. I think the mobilization of individual people and people that are broader than just PCA members, but, average voters, average citizens, to understand, why these things matter to them, why it's in the public interest to change a lot of these rules and regulations that are costing us a lot more money and getting us slower projects and not actually achieving the outputs that we would like to see, why these matter, right? Why these matter now more than ever, in light of getting back to the threats that we see from the Americans, where the productivity challenges that our economy faces are now even more dire. Our ability to get things built on time and on budget is even bigger now, and our labor challenges are probably only even going to grow in terms of labor shortages. So really to focus on what kind of campaigns and how do you mobilize the average person to really care. But secondly, and I think this is where PCA does a really good job, is building coalitions, right? So how do you branch out beyond just your membership to the other aspects of the economy that really care about this? How do you find coalitions with other employer groups, other industry associations, other people in the community that can bring forward the same message to the government, so the government hears it from different angles, from different people, and in different ways? When I worked in the government, it was very easy to say no to one stakeholder if they came forward with an idea. It was really hard if 3 or 4 were coming at it from different angles, and you really felt like this is in the public interest. There's a ton of people talking about this, and people with different aspects of the problem. And so I think to the extent that you can build out, a coalition of people who are interested and supportive, I think, we were really successful in the past on open tendering for this, right? And getting that Bill 66 through the early years of the Ford government. And I think you need to look in be a different coalition in a different way, but build that case, build out those coalitions and have it come from the ground up, right? Have individual voters, individual people, contacting their MPPs and talking about this. I really think you need to lay the why and that there's a problem that needs to be solved there, build that up for the government to realize, because absence of that, they're just going to default to status quo. It is the easiest thing, is to just default to status quo. Things are fine. I'm not hearing about a change. I just, I hear once in a while some people complain, but you need to build that kind of pressure for the government to really feel the need to embark upon change.
Thanks, Sam. I think another good example of that would be the Ontario College of Trades. Very broad stakeholder coalition formed kind of late win years on that, there's a lot of frustration in terms of how that regulatory environment was established, some of the things that the college was doing. So I think that is kind of the perfect case study for the need for a larger stakeholder coalition if you want to impact change. And it was one of the first things they did when they formed government. That was significant. I guess looking forward, we'll wrap it up now, but looking forward, again, a good point to emphasize the historic nature of this win. Ontario politics seems a little sleepy, so I don't think everyone's really woken up to the fact that this is, 3 consecutive majority governments, which really is unheard of. There's usually government fatigue after 2. As you see federally, Trudeau is kind of forced out of the party. So there's always, typically some maneuvering after you've been in power for some time. Ford really maintains a strong consolidation of power, to his credit. I'm curious, over the next kind of the short term, they still need to, they called an election, they did not pass a budget. What do they need to do over the next little while? Do you anticipate any major changes to cabinet? Obviously, they have the majority government now, so they can kind of take their time on some things. But as you noted, this is the time if they want to make some larger policy reforms.
Yeah, look, I think first on the cabinet, my first rule in cabinet speculation is anyone who says anything doesn't know anything, and those who do know never say anything. But I do think, given the approach the premier has taken and the fact that there were not major upsets of cabinet ministers losing their seats, I would expect the cabinet to look relatively similar, likely some movement, but I would say like tweaks, not a major overhaul. I think he feels confident in the team that brought him here and got him a win. So it would surprise me if there was major changes to the cabinet, but like anyone who does know won't say anything. So there's that. Look, they have to present a budget by March 31st. There's a legislative commitment to doing so. I believe that they will adhere to that. I think they will use their platform and the work they did before the election to present a budget. I would expect them to come back probably the week after the March break week, around March 17th would make sense. They could push it back another week and come the week after, but I would say one of those weeks I would expect them to return to the legislature. They've right now, they're in a transition time. They're not taking meetings. The Secretary of Cabinet put out a blast saying to government officials on the bureaucratic side not to meet with stakeholders during this period. So there is kind of a quiet period right now while they're transitioning back in. But they got to hit the ground running, right? They've got this, we're taping this on March 3rd, and March 4th there could be tariffs coming into Canada, and it would be really hard for the premier not to hit the ground running when he just campaigned on being the person to fight on behalf of Ontarians against the threat of American tariffs, to sit back and not bring the legislature back to do so. So I think you'll see them kind of hit the ground running. The budget I would expect to be their platform plus some things that they have been working on in the background. I think as far as the opposition, how they adjust to this, you now have a Liberal Party that has official party status and that received a ton of the vote. This will be kind of a newer dynamic, I think, for the premier, having a stronger Liberal Party to face him in the legislature. As you saw from the campaign, the PCs really viewed the Liberals as their threat, as the party that could defeat them. I think you'll continue to see the focus on the contrast with the Liberals. It's of note that the premier has never faced an elected Liberal leader in the legislature, which is pretty wild to think about, and continues to this day. But the Liberal Party is now official party status. What does that mean? It means they actually get access to money. They now have money. They now have resources. You saw them have 30% of the vote, but really not pick up a lot of seats. And I think that was in large part due to the lack of resources and operational capacity that they have, especially with the federal Liberal leadership going on. So really, one of the things I'm looking for on the political side is, to what extent is the Liberal Party kind of on the upswing, and will they're really going to try to position themselves as, the next government in waiting, and, what kind of tack do they take with Bonnie Crombie still as leader? Does she stay on as leader? Do they move more to the center? Do they try to, steal the NDP's vote? I really think there's a lot of really political intrigue and interest on, how does the Ontario Liberal Party try to build off this election? Because I think for the PCs, it's kind of steady as she goes. Kind of know where they are. We kind of know I don't expect them to change too much. So that's really what I'm really looking forward to, the political nerd in me looking forward to kind of watching over the next few months.
For sure. Well, Sam, we appreciate you being our guest today to talk about the election that just passed. A lot happening over the next little while, possibly a federal election in a few weeks. So perhaps we'll have you on the program again. Hopefully you can join us. And with that, thank you. And I'll end it there.